Hi there, everyone. Welcome once again to Ancient Greek philosophy. Today we're going to be talking about Sextus Empiricus and ancient Greek skepticism. I'm really excited, actually, for the opportunity to be able to talk about ancient Greek skepticism this week because as those of you who are further in the philosophy major might know, philosophy is perennially concerned with what skeptical philosophers might think or do or say in response to their views. You know, if you take like a moral philosophy class or something like that, then it's very likely that you're going to talk about somebody who is skeptical about morality, somebody that doesn't think that morality is real, and then you're going to have people sort of responding to that point of view. You know, very similarly as the way that we in this class sort of talked about Thrasymachus in book 1 and 2 of the Republic as somebody who is skeptical about justice. Justice is all about just the powerful ruling the powerless, right? In the same way that a shepherd flocks their sheep ultimately to slaughter them, right? And so philosophers often view themselves as, in some way, kind of like responding to some person that they usually imagine that is what they call a skeptic or the skeptic or something like that, right? These discussions can oftentimes become a little bit unclear because it's not exactly certain all the time that what people have in mind by the skeptic or something is like the same people. And in fact, there are tons of philosophers who it's like arguable about whether or not at the end of the day that they are a skeptic, right? We're going to discuss Socrates briefly as one example of that. We might also think of like Nietzsche or similar figures if you've maybe been in an existentialism class, right? Descartes is also sort of close here, right? Where some kind of skeptical attitude is really, really important for their philosophical perspective, their philosophical point of view, right? But people debate about whether at the end of the day they are really skeptics, right? In the same way that you might debate whether at the end of the day Socrates was himself really a skeptical philosopher. And so what's useful about Sextus Empiricus is that we have, for once, an unambiguous case, right? It's not just somebody like Descartes or Hume or Nietzsche or someone like that that sort of have skeptical elements or aspects of their philosophy. It's somebody who full on is willing to accept all of the consequences of what this group of philosophers terms as skepticism, and they provide like a really interesting perspective on what that skepticism is, and so that's going to be what we're going to be exploring for today's video. So to start with this column on the left, I've written something like a genealogy of skeptical philosophy, skeptical perspectives. I chose to begin here with Socrates, but for those of you who do the reading before you listen to the video, you might notice that actually Sextus Empiricus brings up even older precursors to skeptical philosophy. He brings up Protagoras, who is ancient Greek sophist, right? Roughly contemporary with Socrates. Plato wrote a dialogue where they talk with one another, right? Sextus also mentions a couple of pre-Socratic philosophers that we've discussed, like Heraclitus and Democritus, is offering similar points of view to the skeptical tradition. But skepticism really starts to come into its own, I think, as a sort of meditation on Socrates' legacy. And then by thinking about Socrates' legacy, they can then kind of identify, okay, yeah, here are some precursors to that perspective in the pre-Socratic philosophers, right? So that's why I've chosen to start out here just with Socrates, right? And you might think that there are certain bifurcating pathways of like digesting or taking up, appropriating Socrates' legacy. One direction, one that we explored in a lot of depth in this class, right, is Plato and Platonic philosophy, right? And you might think about this as sort of the shift that takes place perhaps between the Phaedo and the Republic, right? And the Phaedo or the Apology, right? Socrates is more apt to say something like, well, I can't fear death because I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen after I die, right? Whereas the Republic and the Phaedo, they start taking this line of like, well, in fact, I do know because the forms are eternal and I'm going to be somewhere. My soul is going to commune with the forms, right? And so Plato obviously sees himself as in the tradition, in the legacy of Socrates, and wants to affirm, oh yes, if you think about what Socrates said and you think about it consistently, then the necessary product is Platonic philosophy and all of the myriad details that we've been able to discuss together this semester. But it's also entirely possible for you to take up this point of view where you think Plato didn't really get it. He didn't really understand what was the central philosophical message of Socrates' point of view, right? One way that you might think about it is their differing views on education. Socrates went around Athens, right, and sought an education for himself, right? He wasn't a teacher, he didn't claim to be a teacher. Part of his argument apology is that he's not a teacher, right? He's seeking wisdom, he doesn't have wisdom for other people. Whereas Plato and Platonic philosophy portrays itself as, yeah, we're the philosopher rulers and we really know the answers and we have wisdom, right? We don't just love wisdom. Um, and so, you can trust us. We can not only receive wisdom from other people, but we can actually dispense wisdom in an important way, right? And so I've sort of drawn a bifurcated genealogy here, right? It runs in two directions. One direction is this Platonic philosophy that the ancient Greek skeptics would call sort of dogmatism, right? Dogmatism is sort of a nasty word. No one takes it as a compliment, of course, to be called a dogmatist, right? But a dogmatist, from this point of view, is really just those who think that they have discovered the truth, right? Plato thinks that he's discovered the truth, and the truth is communing with the forms and so on, right? Socrates, at least on this interpretation of Socrates and his legacy, isn't really interested in, hasn't really discovered the truth and isn't really interested in dispensing the truths that he's found to other people. And so, as a result, Plato established the academy after Socrates, of course, and had his own students. Aristotle was one of these people at the academy for some time, right? And, as you might guess, just from the fact that Aristotle was there, right, there was tension between what Plato thought was important for the academy and what later philosophers who would have a more important role, as you get around like 300 BC or so, they start disagreeing with Plato. They start moving Plato and the sort of Socratic legacy, the academy, and so on. They move it in this increasingly skeptical direction, right? And I try to signal that a little bit here just with the colors by making the sort of skeptical philosophers, the primary genealogy that we're interested in here, purple, since purple for the ancient Greeks was like the royal philosophical color, right? And red is here, the dogmatists, right? And so really the way that skepticism starts, right, if you think Plato, okay, Plato says there are forms, right? And these forms constitute the ultimate kind of fundamental reality, right? Plato thinks he's discovered the truth, whereas this tradition says he hasn't. And in fact, none of the prevailing philosophical systems have either. So, not Stoicism, not Epicureanism, none of those points of view have discovered the truth, right? And what the academic skeptics had to say is because they thought nobody could ever discover the truth, that the truth was fundamentally unattainable, right? Uh, one problem that you have if you're a skeptic right away, right? You want to say something like, okay, the dogmatists are all wrong. Those who think they've discovered the truth are wrong, right? The dogmatist is naturally going to turn to you and they're going to ask, well, okay, do you know that? Did you establish the truth of that, right? And the way that the academic skeptics responded is they said, like, truth is impossible, right? Something like this was their sort of view, right? But there are a lot of tensions with that view, right? If you say that nothing is true, can you really be correct about the dogmatists not being right, right? How, it kind of seems like you're trying to have your cake and eat it too by saying that there are no truths, maybe ever at all in any circumstance, and also these people who claim to have discovered the truth are wrong, right? Like, we can establish the truth about that. And so academic skepticism suffered from a kind of inconsistency, or at least that's how it seemed to Pyrrho, who was sort of the founder of ancient Greek skepticism as we really know it. This kind of academic skepticism is relatively unimportant. The people who occupy this are important mostly for historical reasons. We don't really study their ideas very much in a contemporary context or really ever in history. And they weren't really that sophisticated as compared with, what came later. And so Pyrrho is a very interesting philosopher. We have nothing of what Pyrrho wrote. Pyrrho is thought to be like a contemporary of Aristotle, roughly. And to have traveled with Alexander the Great to India, where, Pyrrho learned a lot about ancient Indian philosophy going on at this time, and this was very influential for his point of view, right? And so Pyrrho then developed this kind of skepticism that we call Pyrrhoism, right? And what Pyrrhoism really says is not, okay, we discovered the truth, and the truth is that there are no truths, or something like that, right? This, too, Pyrrho thinks, is kind of a way of being a dogmatist, right? You're still, like, playing the game, right, in certain ways of telling the truth, right? And so Pyrrho thought that the goal of philosophy is not to come up with the right answer, namely, there is no truth, or something like that, right? But instead, the point of philosophy is to help you reach a state of ethical enlightenment. It's actually to help you reach a state called ataraxia, or tranquility, right? Now, what does Pyrrho mean, and what does Pyrrhonic skepticism afterwards take from Pyrrho? Well, really, the idea is that there's something deeply wrong with the way that philosophy is done, right? This might be something that you've thought at some point, either in this class or perhaps other classes that you've taken in philosophy, right? I think it's very normal, especially you're encountering all of these questions that don't have obvious answers, and you just want to be like, maybe nobody knows. Maybe this isn't just the right way of going about this, right? Maybe we haven't discovered the means of discovering the answers at all, and so the best thing that we can do is not like pretend to give the new, biggest, greatest, latest answer, right? but instead to just abstain from the process of giving and asking for reasons in this kind of way, of making claims about fundamental reality and the truth, right? And so this is sort of the characteristic point of view of Pyrrhonic skepticism that characterizes Pyrrho and these later figures. Anicedemus is the earliest sort of like ancient Greek skeptic that we like really have a lot of material still from, and Sextus Empiricus actually rips off some of his arguments, right? And then we have Sextus himself, right, who wrote sometime like 200 AD in a Roman context. A couple things of note that I think are interesting. One is that skepticism never had a school, right? The Epicureans, they had the garden, right? The Stoics had the Stoa. The Platonists had the academy, right? Aristotle started his own academy. And so in each case, these philosophers had kind of like an institutional form, right? It's like, here we know the truth, we distribute the truth, etc. Ancient Greek skepticism is not institutional in this way, right? There is no equivalent place to go and learn about it, right? And instead, where we do have evidence of these points of view, it's primarily people propagating it through writing, right? Which is actually one of the main reasons why it still exists. But it was far from popular. It was not nearly as popular or important in a contemporary way as Stoicism or Epicureanism or even Platonism, right? Even further down into the Hellenistic period and afterwards, you start getting into the ADs, right? Here, still at this point, I mean, Christianity and Stoicism are far more important culturally for both Greece and Rome at this point. And so skepticism really, was not, I don't know, like a very salient option for most people. Most people were not very attracted to this point of view. And one thing that's like of note about Sextus Empiricus is that nothing that he wrote is original. We think that everything that Sextus Empiricus wrote, essentially, he's copying down from previous, Pyrrhonic skeptics, right? And so what happens with Sextus Empiricus really is that, he writes this tract in like 280, right? There's very little reception, interest, etc. at the time. It gets translated sometime around like 1500 or so into Latin, and then boom, certifiable explosion, right? People are now very, very interested in a totally different context about what the ancient Greek skeptics had to say. And so in a way, ancient Greek skepticism was like more important to the development and formation of modern philosophy, modern European philosophy, than it really was for, ancient Greece itself, right? That's just a really interesting, quasi-biographical fact, historical fact about the reception of this tradition, is that in philosophy you will often have that. It's the same in literature as well, where things will be written, they'll go cold, sometimes for several hundred years, a millennia even, right? In the case of Sextus. And then some new context emerges, etc., and boom, it's relevant, right? Relevant in a way that it never has been before. And so that's just some historical facts about the skeptical tradition, right? So now let's get into the meat and potatoes. What is the actual view itself? Well, Sextus characterizes the fundamental principle or the fundamental saying of skepticism as the point that to every account an equal account is opposed, right? Okay, so what does he mean? So to every account, okay, think about any of the philosophers we've discussed to this point. Think about, the ancient Greek atomists, for example, right? You can think of them as giving an account of the universe, right? That it's composed of atoms, right? So we can plug in atomism here. So to every account, parentheses, atomism, an equal account is opposed. So while the atomists maybe are saying there are atoms, or the atoms constitute fundamental reality, then there is this opposed account that atoms do not constitute fundamental reality, right? Similarly, you can plug this in with whatever philosopher we've discussed up to this point, right? You're a Platonist, right? Every account, including the account whereby the forms are fundamental reality, right? There is an equal account that is opposed, right? And so this is the nature of skepticism. The nature of skepticism is to say that your claim, right, to the truth, to exclusive access to the truth, or maybe asymmetrical access to the truth, to privileged access to the truth, is wrong. That there is an opposing perspective that counters or opposes your own perspective, and there's no way to choose between the two of them, right? Now, it's important that even though skepticism obviously has a lot to do with epistemology, right? It's about what accounts we accept, what things we can claim to know, what things we cannot claim to know, and so on, right? It really has an ethical purpose, right? The point is that you're supposed to suspend judgment. You're supposed to no longer be attached to resolving these questions that you have no capability for ever resolving, right? And so in the beginning of the book, Sextus, distances himself from these academic skeptics, right? Why does he distance himself from them? Well, they thought they could render a judgment on things, right? They thought they discovered, okay, there is no truth, right? Something like that. But the ethical point of skepticism is not to give a contrary account to what somebody else says, right? But to lead the listener, reader, to the suspension of judgment, right? The Greek word for this suspension is epoche, which will come to have particular importance for Descartes and later the phenomenological tradition in the 20th century. Husserl was a big fan of this word, right? And ataraxia describes tranquility, right? It begins with this alpha primitive, right? So like atheist or amoral, right? Ataraxia, right? You're not disturbed, right? That's the sense of tranquility. Is that all of these things that otherwise might bother you, right? Oh, if the forms are real, then do I need to worry about my soul? Do I need to worry about my attachment to my body, right? If atoms are what's fundamentally real, then am I made of atoms, right? How many atoms are me and how many atoms are other things near me? How many atoms are my fingertips, right? All of these questions, the skeptic doesn't answer so much as just reveal them to be completely meaningless, right? These things that we were bothered about previously, the skeptic says, you just shouldn't bother, right? You should view every account as equal, right? Equipollence, equal in power, right? You think about scales, for example, that have the same weight on them, right? To every account, an equal account is opposed, right? And it's specifically this equality of the accounts that allows for equipollence, right? And allows you that ataraxia, you're not bothered, you're not leaning in one way or another, you don't have attachments in that way. Now finally, into the skeptical arguments themselves. you might have noticed, if you've looked at the reading already, that the reading talks about skeptical modes, right? In here, you can just think about modes as like ways, or like ways of demonstrating, or ways of arguing, something to that effect, right? He starts out with 10, actually, from some of the oldest skeptics, and then gives sort of more and more updated accounts later on. So, like, he gives these 5 modes that I think are the most sophisticated of them around page 41 of your reading, right? And in general, the skeptical argument looks like this, right? They start out by pointing out, okay, there's a dispute, right? There's a dispute whether or not forms exist, whether or not atoms are fundamental reality, whether or not, virtue is habit, right? In the same way that Aristotle wants to say, right? Take any philosophical issue, right? You want, okay, boom, there's a dispute, right? And so we need a legitimate way of resolving the dispute in favor of one party or another, right? And what the skeptical modes is going to demonstrate is that you don't have any means of doing that, right? So, like, one thing that you might do is you might be like, okay, well, there's been 2,000 years of arguing about ancient Greek philosophy, and we haven't come to a conclusion, right? And so that maybe gives you some reason to be skeptical that we will ever come to a conclusion. We, again, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but we'll move on. So the first thing that they'll do is they'll point out, okay, there's a dispute, right? And then secondly, they will point out that whatever reasons that you can give in favor of your view, right, it itself leads to an infinite regress, right? So, like, if you ask Plato, like, okay, well, why do the forms exist, or something like that, then Plato's likely to start out by saying something like, well, there are mathematical truths, right? And those mathematical truths are eternal and unchanging, and, so on and so forth. And he'll give them as reasons for his view, right? But the skeptics believe, okay, well, put Plato in that conversation with Epicurus, right? And Epicurus will say, well, the forms don't exist because everything that we know is material, and all the material things are divisible into smaller things, right? But that division must end, and those, small things, well, those are atoms, right? What's the point? Well, the point is very much like Plato's point in the Theaetetus, right? That anything that we call grounds for our belief, right? Like a reason why you would prefer Platonism or Epicureanism, for example, sort of presupposes the perspective or orientation that you want to argue for, right? One way to think about it is, well, they're focused on different things, right? Plato's focused on mathematical truths. Epicurus is focused on physical reality, right? It doesn't exactly seem like they're in conflict with one another. Three, relativity. So this is actually the central concern of what Sextus listed as the first 10 modes of skeptical argumentation. And here the skeptical argument is basically just like, okay, you claim you discovered the truth, right? But there are all these perspectives or point of view that aren't like yours, that don't reflect the view that you're stating, right? And so, for example, like, we think that maybe we can discover the reality about appearances because we have sight and smell and hearing and so on. You could imagine an Epicurean saying something like that. But our sight is actually worse than many animals, right? Our sense of smell is worse than many animals. Our sense of smell and hearing and taste and so on differ between each other, right? And between circumstances. And so how, can you really claim to have discovered that truth? Well, there's no, you run into the regress problem again. There's no means of demonstrating that the one perspective or point of view that you have is like privileged in relation to these other perspectives that are not like yours, right? And then 4 and 5, I think that these go together, right? People, the skeptic argues, will often simply take it for granted, their fundamental principle, right? The Platonist might be like, well, because math is eternal, then we know that the forms are eternal, etc., and argue in a hypothetical basis, right? But the skeptic points out that the inference is only okay if the conditional is okay, right? The inference only goes through if the antecedent to the conditional is true, right? And so in the hypothetical mode, they push towards ultimate principles, right? But then it's shown that they don't have any means of justifying those ultimate principles, right? The ultimate principles of an Epicurean are different from the ultimate principles of a Platonist, that are different from the ultimate principles of an Aristotelian, that are different from the ultimate principles of a skeptic, right? And so with the point, with the reciprocal point here, you might also just think of this as circularity, is that you can't give something like a non-biased first principle by which you could establish, like, okay, Aristotelianism is false and Platonism is true, right? Or any other similar perspective like that. I want to cut things short here. There are lots of other really, really interesting stuff about Sextus Empiricus, especially how Sextus deals with the matter of appearances, right? Like, one response you might have to the skeptic is to be like, well, you know, you can't be skeptical about whether or not you need to wake up in the morning. You can't be skeptical about whether or not you need to eat dinner. You can't be skeptical about, you know, all of these necessities of everyday life, right? And Sextus tries to develop an account where you can deal with these objections, where you can say, like, well, what we're skeptical about is not merely the way that things appear to us. What we're skeptical about is the ability to give an account of those appearances, right? And so that's a really interesting aspect of the skeptical perspective that unfortunately we don't have the time to discuss, because I want to try to keep these videos relatively short, but I encourage you to bring it up in your rating responses. I really enjoyed this week. I hope that you are having a great week, and I'm really looking forward to reading your discussion forums. Thanks. Bye.